Greetings from Tokyo, I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Rav. This week, you and I are going to paint the Star Wars Shatterpoint starter set. Let's go. Thanks for joining me in the studio. If you are here for the first time because we're painting Star Wars Shatterpoint, welcome. Normally on the channel, I would talk a little bit about life in Japan, and then we would paint something from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. But thanks to the channel's brand new sponsor, Atomic Mass Games, this marks the start of a brand new series on the channel in which we will paint Shatterpoint minis. And today, we are going to begin with the starter box, or more specifically, the Jedi and Sith heroes and villains within the box. The slightly grainy intro that you saw was shot in the waiting queue for Star Tours at Tokyo Disneyland. Now, having ridden Star Tours at both Disneyland in Anaheim and in Tokyo, I can tell you that the ride is exactly the same, with the exception that all of the voiceover is in Japanese. And let me tell you, you haven't heard Star Wars until you've heard C-3PO speak to you in slightly prissy Japanese. Now, I'm not going to tell you my age, but I am planted firmly within Generation X, so that means I grew up on Star Wars. And as much as I love the universe of Warhammer 40,000, Star Wars is my one true love. Eagle-eyed viewers of the channel may have recognized the artwork hanging in the background, which includes an uncut sheet of Star Wars collector cards, and these, one of my prized possessions, an original set of Ralph McQuarrie concept prints released with The Empire Strikes Back in 1980. And yes, I got them for Christmas. Now, I am fortunate enough to have grown the channel to the point where I was able to reach out to Atomic Mass Games and request a starter set for them. Now, being as incredibly generous as they are, not only did they send me the starter set, but I was shocked when I opened the package to find every expansion that was currently available. Needless to say, I was stunned and overjoyed. I can't wait to work my way through this entire series with you. So let's begin today by painting the heroes and villains from the starter set. We're going to begin by priming our models. A primer coat allows the layers of paint that we will add later to better stick to the model. Now here I've kept the base and the model separate. You don't need to do that. You can just glue them together and begin. I'm using an airbrush here, but if you don't have one of those, don't worry. This paint, Vallejo polyurethane primer, also brushes on really well and gives an amazing finish. And then we'll do a top-down prime of white. Now, this helps describe the shapes of the model, and we can better see where we need to lay in our shadows and things like that. Again, if you don't have an airbrush to do this, don't worry, you can always just dry brush it along the top surfaces. With our primers all set and dry, we're going to begin blocking in our basic colors, and here I'm just working my way around the model, painting the robes. Now you notice there's no reason to be neat here. We're going to be painting some other darker colors on top of this, so just go ahead and block the colors in as best we can. And once that's dry, I'm going to apply a wash of Agrax Earthshade. This will settle into the recesses and create shadows. While I wait for that to dry, I'm going to go ahead and put down the colors that I'm going to use on the leather. And in this case, it's not just a gray. I've also snuck in a tiny drop of purple in there. If you watch the animated show, the leather on the character isn't like a pure cold gray. It actually has a little warmth in it. So I dropped in a little purple here and just worked my way around doing the leather and then the boots and the gloves. Once that's all set, I'm going to drop in my metallics. Here I'm just using lead belcher. I'm going to paint the hilt of the lightsaber as well as some of the smaller details on the model. Once those are dry, I'm going to go ahead and shade all the leathers and the metallics using Nuln Oil. This is a shade from Games Workshop, and I'm using it straight out of the pot here. You can cut this with a little water or some medium to thin it so it's not so impactful, but because we want some really dark shadows in the leathers and the metallics here, I'll just use it straight out of the pot. We'll put that over the gloves, over the hilt of the lightsaber. It's really great at adding definition to metallics. Now once this is fully dry, I'm going to go back in with Administratum Gray. It's a bit of a lighter gray, and I'm going to do some highlights on the high points and folds of the leather. And here we're going to do the same thing on the robes underneath. Now the trick here is just to hit the high points of the ridges and the folds of the fabric. We want to make sure those shadows are untouched. It looks a little too bright, but if you look here where the knee has dried, you can see it. Most paints dry a lot darker than when they first lay down. On the face, I'm going to use some Kislev flesh, and here I'm using a 000 brush and just being really careful not to go over any areas that I've already finished. We spent all that time on the robes and the leather overlay. We don't want to get any skin color on that, so just work our way through there really carefully, and then once that's dry, we're going to apply Reikland Flesh Shade. And this is another wash from Games Workshop, and the trick here is to make sure it doesn't pool up. You want to move it around so it settles into the recesses to give the details, but doesn't obscure anything. Now for the hair, I'm going to use Steel Legion Drab. It's sort of like this desaturated sandy brown. And then I'll use Agrax Earth Shade to bring out the details on that. And then we'll finish the saber by applying some Vallejo Ice Blue along that. Now I've kept the bases separate. Just for me, it's easier if I want to do something like this, like a dry brushing or over brushing technique. With the model on there, it's really tricky. Of course, you want to make sure you don't get any on the model. So I keep them separate. And then once the paint's dry here, I'm going to use some Nuln Oil. And while that's still wet, I actually bring in some Drakenhof Nightshade, which is like a dark midnight blue shade. And then while that's laying there, I'll get a brush full of water, drop that in, and push it around so we get this sort of natural patterns and sort of dirt layers on the metallics. Now, here I chose this base specifically for Anakin because it has these sort of classic Star Wars vents on them. I want to take the opportunity to sort of hint at the fact that he becomes, Darth Vader. Spoiler alert in case you have been living under a rock for the last 30 years. But I wanted to evoke that scene from Empire Strikes Back where they're fighting in the carbon freeze chamber and they have these sort of lights underneath. So we'll just go through, add our oranges, add an overspray with the airbrush, and then again, if you don't have an airbrush, that's completely not a problem. You get the same effect with a really light dry brush of a light orange yellow. Once we've got that where we want it, we'll go ahead and clean up the rim of the base with some black. We'll attach the model to the base using plastic glue to make sure we get a permanent fused bond. And once the glue is set, we'll just use the airbrush to cast a little light on the back of his legs from the vents. Moving on to Darth Maul, we did the same thing. We primed the model in black, and then we did a white zenithal to help describe our shadow shapes. Now, I initially was going to just paint him gray, put a wash on it, and call it done, but then realized this is Clone Wars Maul. I mean, he has the robot legs, so he doesn't wear pure black anymore. He actually has these sort of dirty, sandy robes, so we're going to use Steel Legion Drab on all of the underrobes, and then we'll use Agrax Earth Shade to bring out all of the shadows there. And then the wrap over top, we're going to do in a Mechanicus Standard Gray. Now, unlike Anakin, we're not going to add any additional color to this. We're just going to use the regular cold gray straight out of the pot because that's more like what it looks like on the animated show. So we're going to use that same color on his skin as well. We know that Darth Maul has black skin, but we want some shadow detail. And if you start at black and then shade down to black, you really don't get any of that definition. So we'll stick with this gray. Once we've got our grays down, we'll go ahead and paint the metallics, the legs, and then also around the model. There's some small parts like here in his belt. And when the metallics are dry, we'll shade those as well as all the black leathers. So here we're just using Nuln Oil straight out of the pot. I want to make sure we don't go over any of the browns. It's not going to be the end of the world if you do, but the robes are sort of all set at this point, so we just want to focus on the leathers. Then we'll go ahead and paint the iconic double-bladed lightsaber. Here I'm using Vallejo Bloody Red. It's this really vibrant red, and then I've mixed a little orange right at the hilt there. Now, there's no video of me painting the face. I'm very sorry about that. It was extremely difficult. I found myself using magnifying lenses and just leaning over the figure, and I couldn't line it up with the camera and try and do a decent job of painting it. Honestly, it was a complete nightmare. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The heads are already incredibly small, and it was a miracle I got it even is halfway decent looking as I did. And then here, we're just going to bring out some highlights on the robes. Because the animated series has like a painterly, almost stippled effect, I figured I'd give that a try here and not worry about creating some sort of flawless blend and just sort of stipple that on. And I'm pretty pleased with the way that it looks. It sort of relates to the show, and it reads really well on the tabletop. Now for the base, we're going to do something really similar here again. We're just going to do an overbrush of Lead Belcher, and then we're going to wash in both Nuln Oil and Drakenhof Nightshade. And when that's dry, we'll go ahead and attach the model. I did put some of the marks on the base there as though he'd been spinning the blade and just carving up the floor, which I thought that was a really good match for him. Moving on to Ahsoka Tano, let me just say that I wanted to power through this one. Not because I don't like the character. In fact, she's become one of my favorite Star Wars characters of all time. It's just that I didn't want to be spending hours and hours on each of these, so I thought, what if we just lay down this sort of cold gray purple And then we'll just wash it all over with this contrast paint from Games Workshop called Space Wolves Gray. So I cut that 1-to-1 with the Space Wolves Gray contrast and the contrast medium, just brushed it over the model, and it settled into all the recesses without changing the highlight color too much. Then I went through and I used the gray to do all the armor panels like on the legs and things like that, and then I washed those in Nuln Oil. Now this base is slightly different in that it shows some earth, but it's the same technique. I laid down a bunch of different browns and some washes, and while it was wet, if you just let it dry naturally, it creates these really sort of fun natural patterns, and then you can just sort of dry brush them to bring out the highlights. Here I've gone through and cleaned up all my whites, including her skin and the blades of the lightsaber. Now, her skin is really tricky. It's this orange, but it's not a super punchy or vibrant orange. It's sort of subdued. So I took an orange, Troll Slayer orange, and mixed in some burnt umber, just a touch to knock the saturation back. And we're just really carefully painting that over her face. We don't want to get it all over the braids coming down from the head, but if a little gets on there, like you'll see here, the wash sort of ran over. Not a problem. Dry off your brush, go through, and just soak that back up. Tricky here is not to let it pool up. You just got to keep moving it around with the brush till you get it where you want it. Here we want to darken the recesses around the eyes, but not obscure the rest of the face. One of the last things we had to do are the markings on her tendrils, and although they are not nearly as difficult as the markings on Maul's face, I still found myself struggling with them. Here I'm using a 000 brush and magnifying lenses to try and get them right. And once the stripes were dry, I applied a thin wash of Nuln Oil to bring out some definition in the shapes. If you can't nail these, don't hate yourself for it. It's going to look good on the tabletop. And moving on to our final model in the video today, Asajj Ventress, my absolute favorite Sith. Has been a favorite character of mine since the original animated 2D series and the introduction of her character. There's just something fantastic about her, and I'm glad to see that she got such a big part in the Clone Wars. We'll base coat her dress in a deep purple, and then I'll mix some white in with that purple, and then just use the airbrush to do a top-down zenithal to hit those highlights and shadows in one quick pass. And to unify those purples, we'll take a Games Workshop wash. This is Druchii Violet. We'll apply that all over the model. The trick with this is not to let it pool up. I'm going to keep wicking it away, and then once it dries, you'll see we've got a unified purple with these really deep, rich shadows. Now I'm going to take that purple and put some cold gray into that. It's going to desaturate it, knock it back. We're going to use that on all the wraps on her arms and her waist there. And then we'll take that same purple that we used for the dress, and we're going to do that along the top here. Now we have to be really careful here because the design of the top is a bit strange. It's open in the back, and in the front there's an opening around her bosom, so we want to make sure we're not getting any purple where we want to keep those skin tones. So we're just using a 000 brush here, very carefully working our way around. And now once those purples are laid in, I'm going to use Korax White to go ahead and highlight the skin tones. This is sort of like a sickly gray white, so we'll use it here to bring out her shoulder blades, the top of her arms, her cheekbones, and the ridge of her nose. Once we've got our base colors laid in, we're going to go ahead and do some more shading. Here, again, we're using that Druchii Violet. We're mixing it 1-to-1 with medium here. That makes it a lot less potent, not as punchy as it was on the dress. And then we'll put that all over the wraps and her belt to bring out the detail. Sort of as a final touch on the dress here, we'll go through and use that lighter purple that we mixed up for the wraps and just hit the highest edges of the folds in the dress to sort of force that contrast to make it read a little bit better on the tabletop. Once we have the clothing all done, we'll move on to the rest of the skin. Here, I'm just going to shade the hilt of the lightsaber and her skin with Nuln Oil. This new formulation is really great. It runs into the recesses but pulls away from the high points. It doesn't really change the color of the model too much, but really brings out your shadows. Once we have the skin where we want, one of the last details we need to do here is the gold on her tabard. And here I'm just using a Games Workshop Gehenna's Gold, and I'm using the side of the brush here to catch the raised edges, and then apply that to all the high points in the pattern here. It's going to take 2 coats, but it'll look brilliant once it's on. And then we'll do the lightsabers with that Vallejo Bloody Red. Again, I love this red. It's one of my favorites, and I use it on a lot of my models. It covers really cleanly, and the chroma and vibrancy is just sort of off the charts. It looks great. And then we'll sneak in a little orange there like we did on Maul to accentuate where the lightsaber blade meets the hilt and just sort of add some visual interest. We'll take the Revell Contact to Pro once we've pulled the model off its temporary base, and we'll apply that to the permanent base. This glue is great. It fuses through all sorts of layers of paint and makes a permanent bond. And there you have it, our Jedi heroes, Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano, and our Sith villains, Darth Maul and Asajj Ventress, painted from our Shatterpoint starter set. We have a lot of plastic to go, including the amazing buildings which are included in the kit, but this is a good start. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was my genuine pleasure to make and share it with you. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, comment, and subscribe, and drive us to the front page of YouTube to help grow our audience. And of course, you can always join our Patreon, linked in the description below. Now remember, joining our Patreon at any level grants you access to our private Discord server where like-minded hobbyists help each other become better with honest and kind feedback every day. Thanks again for joining me, and may the Force be with you.